Thank you for coming and thank you for inviting me. Obviously I have to apologize for not speaking French because my French is just practically non-existent due to bad attitude in school. So we sometimes, this was you have to realize that this was in the mid-60s when I was finishing high school and was supposed to study French. And it was the time when the student movement was starting and so on. And so we decided that the French lessons are an insult to Algerians. So instead of going to the class, we would go out to the yard and drink Algerian red wine. So it's not a good way to learn French. So don't do that. But in any case, it's very kind of you that you are conducting this in English, and I'm sure if there are some questions or comments that you prefer to present in French, we can make a translation and reach an understanding. Also, I have to say that it's a little bit difficult. Katja was saying that I already know what is going on here, but the problem is that so much is going on, and the French field of cognitive ergonomics and everything that is related to it is so diverse and rich and develops very quickly that it's very hard to follow and keep up. So I really have to say that I would have much to learn from you, and I'm sorry that we have such a short session. What I will say is not in direct. I cannot directly build connections between this work and the work done here, because I don't feel that I am competent to do that. But perhaps through dialogue, these connections will emerge. And to start out, I think that we are living at a time when expertise must be redefined. We must kind of reconceptualize what we mean by expertise. Classic cognitive studies of expertise stemming already from the work of Herb Simon and his colleagues, they were very much focused on the idea that expertise resides in the individual practitioner, and expertise is learned through massive amounts of repetitive practice. Classic examples of expertise were chess players, physicists solving very well constrained physics problems, or even typists or people who were doing very mundane tasks where you could measure the output very exactly. And what is happening is that the world of work has changed so much. It seems clear that experts cannot solve their tasks or maintain their expertise alone. The lonely expert is becoming an anomaly. Obviously, in many professions, there is still the kind of myth of the superior medical doctor or the superior engineer. But in practice, you see that expertise typically almost always happens in various forms of collaboration. And this realization obviously pushed researchers in the 1990s to move beyond the traditional notion of expertise. I mentioned here Ed Hutchins and Jean Levin and Etienne Wenger, who both in their own ways located expertise in larger collectives. In the case of Ed Hutchins, it was in systems of human beings and their technological artifacts, such as, for instance, on board of navigating a large ship or flying a large airplane. And in case of Jean Levinetti and Wenger, it was within what they call communities of practice, and they looked at the traditional sites of apprenticeship in which the masters, around the masters, there are a number of more junior people working and learning from the master. But in both cases, the unit of expertise was expanded beyond the skin of the individual. About the same time, Carver Ryder and Marlene Scardamelia in Canada, they were working on a related notions of expertise, made explicit in their book called Surpassing Ourselves, in which they were pushing for the idea that the experts do not learn just by repetitive practice, but they have to go beyond their own established skill and mastery in situations which require novel solutions. In other words, they claim that what is typical to experts is that they continuously have to surpass themselves and engage in sort of going beyond what is already known. And so these two dimensions, one questioning the traditional notion of learning by repetitive practice, the other one questioning the notion of expertise residing inside the individual. I think they have opened up a new landscape of understanding expertise in real life. And I would to try to couch this a little bit more in historical and sociological terms. We could think that the traditional notions of expertise are actually related to ideas of craft, where the lonely craftsman could be seen as a sort of ideal typical expert. And learning, indeed, was happened in a relatively stable environment where a lot of repetition would lead to refinement and perfection of the skill. And the two obvious directions forward in history have been, on one hand, the creation of large bureaucratic constellations of expert work, and on the other hand, the situating expertise in markets in which rapid innovation or novelty seeking is of utmost importance. And obviously, if you think in those terms, the question is both market-based and bureaucratic models of expertise tend to have severe problems. We know quite well what large bureaucracies can mean in terms of lack of flexibility, inability to face new situations in a creative way. And on the other hand, the market-based models often tend to lead to a situation where individual gain or profit is the driving motive, and the idea of the common good or collective good is forgotten. So that's why I propose in the book that we should look for possibilities to develop and work toward what I call collaborative and transformative expertise, in which both these dimensions somehow are combined and transcended into new forms of expertise, which are both oriented to the common good and collaboration, and at the same time flexible and creative. So you could say that this is perspective which is certainly not easily achieved, or that you can't easily find good, nice examples of this kind of expertise. If we look at the real world, for instance, the world of medicine, which I have studied in this book, and the book actually summarizes about 30 years of work in this field. What we see is obviously an increasing marketization and increasing pressures of profit orientation in medical expertise. The idea of going beyond that somehow is not easily put into practice. But anyway, so this is where I start, and this is the general framework within which the studies included in this book are presented. And I also argue that at least in the work I've done in the medical field, we have identified three important conceptual ideas or spearheads that might be used to move toward collaborative and transformative expertise. And one is the idea that expertise is situated in object-oriented and contradiction-driven activity systems. In other words, that we should actually study expertise through the lens of activity systems. And this is obviously a straight derivation from my theoretical background coming from cultural historical activity theory. Second point is that the forms of collaborative expertise that have been identified mainly have been various forms of teamwork or networks. And my claim in the book is that both teams and networks are insufficient notions to understand the kind of expertise that needs to develop. Teams tend to be understood traditionally as relatively stable formations in which a group of workers find a kind of common shared platform to work together over longer periods of time. In reality, in today's work, the teams do not remain stable. It's very rare to find stable teams. Teams tend to dissolve continuously and to be reorganized all the time. And it's not an accident that some colleagues like Schrade, for instance, his latest book was called No More Teams. In other words, realizing that the classic idea of teamwork as a sort of nice home for a group of workers is not anymore valid. It's not happening like that. And the world is much more in turmoil, and the teams do not remain stable. And on the other hand, the notion of networks has the characteristics that networks are in some sense taken as infrastructures rather than as the loci or the contexts in which actual agency and new ideas generate by identifiable subjects. Networks tend to be understood more sort of almost as a mathematical phenomenon rather than as a phenomenon of subjectivity and collaboration. So the proposal is the notion of not working with a K, meaning that we need to understand expertise as rapidly pulsating forms of coming together of different experts, different practitioners and their clients to solve problems and complete tasks which are continuously changing. And this means that there is not a fixed or stable center. The center doesn't hold. And this type of working, what I call not working, means that a crucial aspect of expertise is the capability of actually creating these knots and dissolving them when they are not needed, and then reorganizing again. It's a pulsating notion of collaboration rather than as a stable notion of collaboration. And finally, the third spearhead that I propose is the notion of expansive learning, which challenges the idea of learning as acquisition of the given, and proposes that experts increasingly need to actually go, just like the writer Scardamelia already said, that they need to go beyond the given. But how that is accomplished, for instance, in the writer Scardamelia's work, that's mainly accomplished as a sort of cognitive phenomenon within the actors, whereas I would like to see expansive learning in terms of something that is strongly oriented to transforming the world out there, the objects and actual material practices are being transformed rather than just the sort of the cognitive structures within the practitioners. And so I will return to each one of these spearheads, but the point is that I'm claiming in the book that the movement, the transition of expertise toward collaborative transformative forms of expertise may be understood and facilitated by employing these three spearheads. Now, much of the empirical and interventionist research that I have conducted in different domains of medical work is indeed put together in this book. But I would like to go a little bit beyond the book in this presentation and use material from quite recent work that we have been doing in a related domain, but it's not included in the book. And this domain is the home care of the elderly in the city of Helsinki. For those who would expect that I talk specifically about medicine, I probably, none of you is here for that reason, but basically the disappointment is that I don't want to speak now about medical doctors, but I would like to speak more about very mundane kind of care. You know, when an old person lives alone at home and has multiple illnesses, but they're not so severe that this person needs to be institutionalized, then the person needs some help at home, home care. And this is becoming a huge challenge for many societies, especially those in which the aging of the population is happening very rapidly. Finland is one of them, that there, the phenomenon is very familiar around the industrialized world. Japan is another dramatic example where the aging of the population is happening extremely fast. The challenge is, how do we take care of these people who live much longer than they used to, but they're also much more sick. They have all kinds of illnesses, and yet they want to live on their own. And it's also a necessity because we cannot afford to put them all in institutions. It would be extremely expensive. So this is to put it bluntly, this is the dilemma that many governments and and policymakers are facing today. And home care, from my point of view, is also interesting in that it's clearly an area where you know, the limits of the medicine become visible. Traditional medicine, which is totally dominated by the doctor's expertise, and where the patient is you know, the best patient is unconscious, basically, because there's least trouble. So basically, this traditional notion of the total monopoly over the expertise in the hands of the medical doctor is clearly not valid in home care, because the people who live at home, they eventually, you know, they do their own, make their own decisions, and yet they need also medical help. But medical help is not understood narrowly. It's intertwined with all kinds of practical issues, such as nutrition, hygiene, etc. And it's important to notice that even though home care may look like it's a sort of a marginally interesting activity, but often it happens so that new forms of work and expertise may emerge from the margins and not from the traditional centers of competence and power. So these are images. We have been conducting this work in the field of home care now about 10 years in the city of Helsinki, and conducting also interventions to help the practitioners work out new ways of working. And much of the data collection that we have done happens through videotaping actual home care visits, where the practitioner, the home care nurse, or the home care professional goes to the home of an elderly person to carry out certain tasks. Classically, these tasks are limited to very basic, making sure that the person is fed, that there is nutrition, making sure that there is hygiene, and making sure that the person takes the medicine. These are the three basic pillars of the, at least in the city of Helsinki, which often means that the standard home care visit is very much done for the client rather than done with the client. The client remains sort of recipient. But at the same time, the clients, the elderly people themselves, have completely different concerns. They're worried about being alone, the loneliness. They're very much worried about losing their mobility, their ability to move around, and they are very much worried about losing their memory. In other words, various kinds of memory failures and memory diseases. These issues are so big that home care traditionally tries to avoid them. In other words, they remain in the limbo. The busy home care worker takes care of hygiene, nutrition, and medication. But nobody talks about loneliness, memory, and mobility. So there's a gap, in a way, quite a serious contradiction between the standard script of the home care visit and the actual deep-seated needs, long-term needs of the clients. Oftentimes, this gap and tension then manifests itself in various kinds of disturbances, of miscommunications, dissatisfaction, but not very often articulated in any very clear way. So we can look at this first through the first spearhead idea of activity systems. If we use this type of a model, those of you who may have looked at my my work previously might be sick and tired of the triangles, but this is a basic representation of an activity system. In this case, obviously, two interacting activity systems as the locus of expertise. In other words, one of them would be the client, the other one would be the home care worker or home care nurse. And the issue is that they, at the moment, how they see the object, they see it from in a very different perspectives. One of them is much concerned about these big long-term issues, like I mentioned. The other one is much more concerned about fulfilling the tasks of today's script within next 15 minutes, basically. So these two are not easily, finding the common ground between these two objects is a challenge. So we can, in a way, open up this, the same basic picture, thinking that on the left there is the home care client, whose basic object now, if we focus on mobility, because this turned out to be, from our point of view, in the research and in the interventions, an issue in which we could really make a breakthrough. You know, you can't do everything at the same time, and the physical mobility turned out to be something where both the practitioners and also the clients were willing to engage in a serious effort to redefine their work. So I'm now focusing on the physical mobility as a challenging area of transformation, of expertise, and of the life of the clients. So from the point of view of the client, the issue is that, yes, I want to be mobile, but I'm scared to death to fall down. Because falling down may mean that I will be immobile for the rest of my life. And in Finland, that's serious, because you go out about this time of the year and it's slippery, because there's ice, and very soon there is a lot of snow too. So falling down is a very common final cause of losing one's mobility forever. Because if you break your hip, if you're 80 years old, you break your hip, and then it takes a long time to heal, and during that time you're hospitalized. That's a moment when you usually lose many other aspects of your functioning and may remain bedridden for the rest of your life. And this becomes extremely expensive for the society and extremely unfortunate from the point of view of the life quality of the client. So this object for the client is this very contradictory object of safety versus autonomy. I want to be autonomous. I want to move around. At the same time, I'm very worried about it because it may put me at risk. And from the point of view of the worker, it's much more, the challenge is, I need to take care of my routine tasks. I really don't have time to activate the client to teach her some exercises to be mobile. But this is clearly needed. So the challenge of how not to overload my own schedule, and yet how to be responsive to the client's needs is there. That's also very clearly an economic issue. You know, if I spend too much time with one client, then my whole schedule will suffer, and my bosses will say, "What the heck are you doing?" Now, what we developed was, together with the practitioners in these interventions, was this what is called an instrument called mobility agreement. It's an agreement made between the client, negotiated between the client and the home care worker, looking at different exercises, testing them, and designing a schedule for regular exercises for the client that are as much as possible embedded in the everyday chores at home. So, for instance, you know, what you have to do anyway at home, but you do it so smartly that you use those movements that you have to conduct at home as purposeful exercises, so that it minimally increases the sort of burden both on the worker and the client. So embedding these exercises in the normal everyday life chores of home. So this meant that indeed a new crucial instrument, new practice is introduced, which is supposed to, which is an attempt to transcend the objects, the current objects, and to move towards something which is, which we began to call sustainable mobility. It also means transforming the dominant notion of mobility. Because the dominant notion of mobility you get in the commercial media and advertisement, etc., is this heroic athlete. You seldom see in a media an old person who is also sick doing mobility exercises. You know, the idea of mobility, what kind of mobility is it when it's not running a marathon or something like that? What is it? It's almost alien, because the dominant media images, they have eliminated that. You don't see much of that. It has to be rediscovered and reconceptualized. And sorry. So the second spearhead, not working, as I said, it refers to pulsating movement of tying, untying and retying together otherwise separate threads of activity. And there is no specific permanent center of power. It shifts. And it requires both rapid improvisation and long-term perspective. And typically it operates by means of negotiation and flexible agreements. Now, in this case, the notion of not working was implemented through rather interesting situations where typically, you see, the home care worker for a single client does not remain the same. Oftentimes there are shifts that a different person has to enter, or sometimes there come two professionals. One is a physical therapist and one is the regular nurse, etc. It is not permanent. And then on the other hand, also the client may have a family member suddenly there, or a neighbor. So there is you have to sort of renegotiate the constellation of expertise, we gradually developed this kind of a conceptualization of these different forms of collaboration in these home care encounters. The most sort of straightforward and traditional one would be coordination, which is on the lower left-hand corner, where you follow the given script. And typically when the home care worker initiates that shall we discuss a possibility of starting physical mobility exercises. This means breaking the script, sort of suspending the script to focus on the shared problem or task, moving from coordination to collaboration, where you actually problematize the situation and refocus. You at least temporarily put aside the script, the given list of tasks that you are supposed to perform, and you discuss how to introduce something new. But eventually, you know, that just introducing some new idea or taking a situational approach that let's try something new right now, it will require, if you want to reach some permanent results of change, it will require that you have to actually discuss the whole script. How should this be changed? It's not just suspending the script, but it needs to renegotiate and question revise the script. And this is what we call communication. In other words, this typically involves not only the immediately present people, it reaches out to the, what can we do? What kind of constraints are we under? This we typically did with the help of, that's when the actual mobility agreement was worked out and signed, as a written document and included in the care plan of the client as a new element, which had to be then also, of course, approved by the supervisors of the home care worker, because it would mean often some changes in the scheduling, some changes on how much time is used per client. But a fourth type of collaboration which we found, which occasionally happened, which is actually rather amusing, it was what we call carnivalization, to take the word from Bakhtin. The situations where the whole thing looks like it's falling apart. Like if you remember Jacques Tati's film, in which there's a restaurant scene. A new restaurant is opening and people are coming in, but while they start to have their dinner, the restaurant starts to fall apart, and the whole it's at least a half an hour period when the restaurant visitors are at the same time trying to have their dinner and to deal with the falling apart of the restaurant, and they get engaged in a purely carnivalesque way in combining these activities of trying to keep the place physically still somehow manageable and at the same time having their dinner. So this type of a situation where people engage in a sort of playful way to reshape the whole situation occasionally happens in these home care encounters. For instance, so that the client suddenly introduces something which was not expected. An example would be when we had in one case a couple, both the wife and husband are over 80 years old and have various illnesses, and in the middle of the regular script, the husband brings in an old photo album of memories, mementos, and introduces it into the discussion, which is totally sort of breaking the script. And the home care workers somehow get into this, that they at the same time they talk about the album and about the script that they are supposed to do, and it becomes absolutely humorous often, because people start drawing very unexpected connections between what did you do during the wartime and what are we supposed to do tomorrow, and what are we doing right now. In other words, the situation is opened up for playful experimentation and playful reconceptualization. And this type of, and also of course the traditional roles of who is leading the situation are often switched, so that the client takes over and suddenly gives a completely new direction to the process. So what seems to us in this study to be of crucial importance is that part of expertise is to consist in the ability to move between these different types of collaboration, and to switch and combine them in flexible ways. Obviously none of them is alone sufficient, or none of them is alone the more superior than the others. But somehow it's a repertoire for flexible not working with the clients. So this is the what seems to be the conclusion for that. And then the third one about expansive learning. In this situation that we're talking about, the learning process had to happen at multiple levels. On one hand, the city of Helsinki had to learn to include in the regular home care services this physical mobility aspect. And now about nearly 10,000 clients in Helsinki of home care have actually this mobility agreements. And so it has gradually happened, but it has been a tremendous struggle. You know, we've been observing for 10 years, because oftentimes there is this kind of resistance that this breaks down the current practices, the current rules. How do you include this? So at the level of a very large entity such as the city healthcare services, it's a long-term learning process. But then on the other hand, you observe this learning process at a very minute level. Every visit to a home where in which this new mobility agreement is introduced and implemented, may perhaps renegotiated, is a learning process itself for both parties, both for the home care worker and the client. So it's a different kind of notion of learning that we're talking about here. Something new is being generated at multiple levels. So the idea of expansive learning as a sort of theoretical idea is that it's something where people engaged in an activity reconceptualize and reconstruct the very object and the very idea of their activity through a lengthy process of moving from one type of a learning action to another. And the lesson for us has been that you have to use to understand this expansive learning at very different scales. One scale might be 10 years at the scale of a city. The other scale might be 20 minutes in an encounter between a home care worker and a home care client. So it's a matter of adjusting to the scale and looking at what is happening in a very different grain size of the analysis. But the point here is, which is very important, is that there must be a sort of a moment or multiple moments in which the new solution, the new model, the new idea is constructed as what we call a germ cell idea. Now, in this case, this germ cell idea emerged in a very funny way, because we had introduced this leaflet of different mobility agreement, mobility exercises to the clients, and they went through them and made this agreement. So I do this and this and this so often, and some of these things I do alone, some of it I do when the home care worker visits, so we do it together. And the more we observe and videotape these situations, we notice that one exercise became a kind of a crucial gateway, and that was standing up from the chair. It may sound rather funny, but standing up from the chair in a way crystallizes the contradiction of mobility for an old person. If you sit on a chair and you stand up by using your hands as a support, it's different from doing it without the support. If you do it without the support, you actually exercise your thigh muscles every time. If you do it with this, especially if the chair has this, so that you can really use your hands. It's minimal advantage from the point of view of mobility. So standing up from the chair can be done by avoiding exercise or by actually using it as an exercise. And you see this here. And the very notion that you can do it, because standing up from the chair is something that you have to do all the time. Unless you want to sit all day just in one place. So the idea that it can be used purposefully and meaningfully to increase my mobility was a huge revelation to many of the clients and actually to many of the workers too. So it was actually discovered little by little in practice. And then we went into literature and noticed that there is quite a lot of literature on that, but it never is really understood that it can be this kind of gateway. It's just recommended. It's an important exercise, standing up from the chair. And so in a way, this germ cell looks like this. On one hand, you have the safety, fear of falling, use of furniture or other persons as support, easy and safe but makes you dependent. On the other hand, the autonomy, need to move, use of one's own muscles, hard and risky but makes you autonomous. And you have to learn to manage this contradiction. You cannot eliminate it. For instance, a client who has grasped this might say, this chair is very deep, so I'm going to use my hands there, because otherwise it's too risky. But the regular chairs, I don't use my hand. I use my thigh muscles, and I do it 5 times instead of 1. It may look funny, but it doesn't take much time, but doing it 5 times is very efficient. And sometimes I do it 10 times. And sometimes, the client says, sometimes what I do is, when I set the table for my meal, I sort of forget a couple of utensils, so that I have to stand up again from the chair and go and get them. So, in a way, the client purposefully forgets in order to make herself do a little more of the standing up from the chair. It's a classic example of Vygotsky's idea of double stimulation, that they're using these missing utensils as a sort of second stimulus to enhance your own will to act. And so the idea of expansive learning is not just, going through this cycle, but actually going through it so that you discover a new foundational, what we call a germ cell idea that has generative power then. And this is just a case study we published of one client with whom we do this in great detail, but the point was that we, from this germ cell idea, various kinds of trails emerged. For instance, the back gets straighter and the person starts to pay attention to one's posture using the mirror, or improved mood, care of oneself, regular walks. The client even says that I for the first time in 10 years, I actually went alone to visit my daughter's birthday party. So this type of expansion and generativity from the germ cell idea, but the client says very clearly, it's a very simple idea that you have to get to start gaining mobility. It's the very simple idea that standing up from the chair is not just standing up from the chair, but it can be very smart standing up from the chair. So this, but finally, one more point is that in these very small cycles that we can observe in these encounters, which may last 20 minutes or half an hour, these home care visits, what is happening is not just sort of straightforward expansive learning. It is at the same time extremely contradictory process where typically it may be that one of the parties, let's say the client, is resisting and trying to not engage in this kind of mobility exercises. And the other party, let's say in this case the home care worker, is trying to move forward to implement the home care, the mobility agreement. So we analyzed in detail 30 encounters and found that there are all these combinations where in one type is where both parties are actively engaged in a sort of what we call plus in expansively trying to implement the mobility agreement. And then there are cases in which both are resisting. It's a minus, in which both the actions are actually actions of avoidance and resistance. And then there are these combinations where one is primarily resisting, the other one is primarily pushing forward. All these variations. So these are not pure processes. They are very mixed processes, and when you analyze them in detail, you often find that it's these differences that make them dynamic. So the very notion of that there is conflict going on, they're not open conflict, they're not starting to fight or disagree openly. They're more subtle disagreements of avoidance, resistance, switching the topic, saying that, hey, isn't it a nice looking sun out there, rather than talking about the mobility. So there, it's very subtle, and it requires very, very detailed analysis, which we tried to conduct in this most recent article in the Journal of the Learning Sciences this year. And we call this expansive and defensive learning cycles, which are intermingled and mixed. And that dynamic, I think, is actually reality almost everywhere. It's never pure, but there are ways to identify what is predominant in each case. And one fact that we found that in those cases, in those encounters where there was mismatch, one being primarily oriented to defensive resistance, the other one more oriented toward expansive. These mismatches generated more learning actions than those in which there was unanimous approach. In other words, this kind of let's say discoordinations between these two parties were also factors that would call for more efforts, more learning efforts, to generate more learning actions. So, and this, of course, anybody who knows that cognitive conflicts can be very generative of learning, that's fine. But in this case, they had this very peculiar nature that they are not open conflicts, but much more like subtle mismatches, and identifying them and exploiting them, perhaps in the future more deliberately, may be of great importance in this case. So, to conclude, activity theoretical studies, from my point of view, should treat expertise as ongoing collective accomplishment, which is manifested in actions and activity systems, both in short time span and in a very long historical perspective. So expertise is historically changing, and we need to situate studies of expertise in the historical fields of transition. And this change is driven by contradictions in these expert activity systems. From my point of view, new forms of expertise are discovered and enacted and actually fostered and nourished by formative interventions in which the researcher becomes an active promoter or facilitator, much in the vein that is very well known to you who conduct here the clinics of activity or for us in the change laboratory type of interventions, which are obviously talking about this type of interventions, it would be an entirely different topic. So this is what I have to say, and I hope that we can then, I know that many of you actually study teachers, and I haven't said anything about teachers' expertise, and I feel a little bit bad about that, but perhaps in the discussion we can get also into that. Thank you. Sorry for my French.
In your book, you're talking about Bateson's level learning model, and you said the third level is the level from the expensive learning, and you say also said that this level is rare and dangerous. Could you explain why you think it's rare and dangerous?
Yeah.
Vous avez pas entendu?
Il y a un micro.
Oui, je disais que dans ce bouquin, il faisait référence au modèle de Bateson sur l'apprentissage. Dans ce troisième niveau, qui correspond à l'apprentissage expansif, il considère que c'est rare et dangereux. Je lui ai demandé pourquoi il pensait que c'était rare et dangereux.
Yeah, Bateson, you know, his work came from this very early classic mixture of anthropology and clinical psychiatric work with. He was particularly working on schizophrenia, and then. But interestingly enough, because he was a very versatile man, he also studied, for instance, animals. But that's a different story. But his levels of learning, the first level of learning is basically simple conditioning. The second level of learning is when you learn the context of the conditioning. So to put it in a school situation, it would be like the first level for Bateson is when you learn the right answers, what the teacher expects. You know, you immediately give the right answer when the teacher asks. So that's the first level. The second level is that whether you want it or not, you also learn to be a student. You learn to observe. If everybody raises their hand, even if I don't know the answer, it's pretty safe to raise my hand. It looks better. You know, because it's unlikely that the teacher will ask me. I don't raise it very high. I just raise it like this, so it looks good, but it's not too noticeable. So we all learned this in the school, and many other things of how to be a student. So that's the second level of learning for Bateson. It's the learning the context of the first level. And the third level for him is when you break out of that context and you say, this is intolerable. When you get messages that are completely opposite. For instance, in the school it would be that you're told, be active, shut up, be quiet. So, how do you do both? So, Bateson says that when there's enough of this absolutely contradictory communication, people, sometimes they just say, this is enough. There's got to be a world out there which is wider and gives me different possibilities. In other words, you engage in breaking away from this context and finding a new, wider context. And this is for him dangerous. Obviously, you know, I mentioned about my school experiences in the 1960s. A lot of us just quit the school. And that's dangerous, you know. It might be that you end up on the street unemployed. But it was the 1968 generation, as you know, we had this kind of feeling that this is enough. We don't want to be trained as robots. I don't know if it was an adequate idea, but that's how many of us felt. So it was a double bind, as Bateson would call it. And then you break out into something that you don't know yet. And you have to discover and rebuild a bigger context. And that is dangerous. And so Bateson says that many people go nuts. if you try to do it only alone, you end up being marginalized, pushed out, and you may actually, you know, lose your sanity. So for Bateson, this was obviously an issue of great potential and great risk. If I transpose this to the work on expansive learning, obviously the idea is to try to minimize the risk a little bit, so that, but it is a risk. If you start an intervention like this among professionals and clients in a certain setting, they may at some point just kick you out, or decide to use authority to suppress the whole issue. This happens. We all know that. I'm sure that also people who do clinics or activity have had situations where the intervention breaks down. Or if you haven't, then you have been very fortunate. But the challenge is that when you engage in a learning which sort of questions or criticizes the existing situation and says this is not tolerable anymore, that immediately puts you in the position of being a troublemaker. And that's dangerous enough. So maybe the yellow vests are experiencing this at the moment. But so this is what I'm. I think that the greatest examples of expansive learning are large-scale processes of liberation, like for instance the breaking down of the apartheid in South Africa. It's a very long historical process of expansive learning, and it has been very dangerous. But at the same time, we seldom think about those processes as processes of learning, and they must be seen at multiple levels.
I have a question about your empirical study about home care workers.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning, you show a schema with the client, with two sides, the client and the home care worker. And after you say it's more complex than that, because in fact you have also the family,
Yeah.
which is very important and intervene a lot,
Yeah.
especially when the client is not very autonomous.
Yes.
It's more dependent.
Yeah, especially with the dementia issues. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you said, also there are several home workers in general.
Yeah, oftentimes there are 2 or 3. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we had the study about that, and we saw that it's very complex and difficult for all these people to coordinate, to negotiate. You talked about it. You
Yeah.
talked about that. And then I was wondering after, what is the type of learning you're talking about? And you talk mainly about learning how to stand up from the chair. But isn't there also this crucial learning of communicating, coordinating between all these actors, the
Yeah.
coordination? Do you see it as also a learning?
Yes.
A collaborative learning?
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of, we saw artifacts for that, there are notebooks to say what has to be done, how is the patient,
Yeah.
and the family says, I want you to do that, and to check that my parent has eaten, for instance, and then there, and also they stick papers everywhere in the house, for instance, in the fridge, on the fridge when it's
Yeah.
examining the food, and
Yeah.
so do you consider also that as a learning,
Yeah.
the collaborative learning of how to cooperate, communicate, and transmit all this information about the patient, about the task of the different person, and so on?
I do. I treated it under the not working notion, but this kind of movement, I think, is you have to see it somehow as intertwined with the expansive learning of the actual so-called contents. But here I don't think that it's only a movement from you know, from simple to the complex, but it's much more learning how to use all these variations, to the whole repertoire of interpersonal collaboration and communication. And you're quite right about also the role of the artifacts in this. I mentioned as an example of, you know, the carnivalization mode is often important because especially if there is a tendency to get stuck with the coordination, you know, following the script. The carnivalization of turning it into a playful situation may actually be also the breakthrough so that negotiations can start. Carnivalization often seems to require that some sort of an external artifact is turned into a shared means of distancing from the script. In the example I mentioned, it was the photographs of the husband in the house, and then this turned into him telling stories of the wartime and them getting mingled with the present time and so on. So yes, we have studied in particular one article which I didn't mention here. We studied also the opportunistic use of artifacts in these home care visits. For instance, you know, there are very many of them. I mentioned these utensils, for instance, that the lady purposefully forgets to put some things on the table, so she has to stand up again. But there are others, for instance, taking out the trash can become a very important instrument, in a way, for collaborative work. A lot of this very mundane, and the interesting thing is how they interact with the new artifact which we have introduced, namely the mobility agreement. And the mobility agreement very quickly is not anymore used as a text, but as something that is continuously orally and in a bodily enactment is turned into a reality. So the mobility agreement is much more a sort of enacted than written agreement. But it's an artifact also, and it has to somehow connect. For instance, the good example I think is that a client told us in a very proud way that I have learned to take walks around the dinner table, and I count how many times I walk, and today I did my record 20 times. And the home care workers, isn't that a little too much? You know, you see that immediately that there's a back and forth between the safety, protective attitude versus the more expansive attitude, and how these are negotiated. But they require these specific artifacts, like in this case, the counting of the laps around the table, so that you get focused, that they anchor the learning and the collaboration into something very materially specific. This seems to be of very crucial importance. I don't know if I answered your question, but
Mustafa?
Thank you for the presentation. I have one question and one comment about home care. The question is about emotional labor, because it can be part of home care workers, so it can also be part of learning and expertise. So
yes.
Do you have anything to say about it? And my comment is about the contradictions between safety and autonomy regarding standing up.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that, well, it seems to me that safety does not necessarily contradict autonomy. For example, for people who have serious problems regarding mobility, using objects in the environment to stand up can be seen as resources for autonomy and also for safety. So this idea of contradiction between safety and autonomy, is it the point of view of the analyst, or is it from the point of view of the home care workers? Thank you.
That's very good. I start from the second question. Indeed, that's a very good question. The contradiction between safety and autonomy indeed must be transcended, like you said, and it can be transcended. It is not a contradiction that is stagnant. And it is transcended by let's say, smart movements, where you use, for instance, artifacts in a smart way. Not so to avoid exercise, but to make the exercise safe, for instance, like you said. So this is the point. But the contradiction definitely came from the home care workers. For them, it was a continuous issue of, no, we can't, because it's too risky. And it's interestingly enough, we can trace it back, for instance, in Finland there is a large institution called the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health and Safety, in which there has been studies of the, old people's risk of falling down, etc., and they have identified this in their large-scale studies as the main conflict that easily leads to regressive cycles in which people start to avoid movement, and this is now from the point of view of the clients. In other words, if you have a couple of experiences of falling down, even if you fall down just at home and you don't break any bones, but it can be a close call, which means that from now on you don't dare to walk much at all. And this kind of loss of the courage to move is a crucial element in this. And when it creates a kind of vicious cycle where the home care worker is worried, afraid that the client may fall, and the client is worried that she may fall, it creates a kind of a vicious cycle that eliminates mobility. So mobility is not just a loss because of a physical deterioration happening autonomously. Now, it's also constructed by these human beings, these practitioners and their clients together. It's not loss of mobility is not an irreversible physical process only. It is something that is constructed, and it therefore can be also transcended and redefined. So you're quite right about it. But the contradiction is definitely, it comes from the top of the practitioners, that they find it again and again and again. And they say quite openly, even when we're videotaping them, they might say, please don't do that, that's too dangerous. So, and then they might start actually laughing at themselves because they have been just learning about how important it would be. But it's very deep-seated. Especially, I think, largely because there's this broader professional ethos, which is the old-fashioned of do it for the client, don't do it with the client. And this is the sort of broader transformation that is going on.
Is it because they are accountable for what happens in the situation?
Yes, also, yes. Of course, they are not, you can't be completely, put in a court and blamed for somebody falling down in your presence, but they are accountable, certainly. They should provide safety. They should take care of safety. So, but at the same time, they should above all be worried about the loss of vital functions like mobility. So this is a contradictory, they are under contradictory job description, so to speak. That the job demands are in themselves contradictory. This is of course very common. We all have experienced that. We, as a researcher, we're supposed to do all kinds of funny things, like publish 1 million articles a year, and yet say something new and interesting. Good luck. But the thing is here that, yeah, okay, this was the second question, but your first question about emotional labor is a very good one. This is deeply emotional labor, and perhaps the reason why we have sort of postponed putting this aspect in the front is that Finns are very good at not expressing emotions. So if this was done in Italy or even in France, I think that it would be much more salient. But in Finland, people are very, you know, they don't show emotions very easily. So we are only starting this aspect of analysis. I'm not very happy with the existing instruments for analyzing emotions at work. So, you know, we're working on some new instruments to develop the analysis. If you have some good hints for me, I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah, maybe at least
I mean,
some hints on it, but I suppose that these workers learn to manage their emotions.
Yeah, yeah.
So it could be interesting to see how they learn that.
Exactly, yeah. But at the same time, you know, for any kind of, you know, when you extend your approach to the emotional aspect of the activity, I think that you need solid methods and instruments and solid conceptualizations. So we're building on Spinoza, but that's a long way from Spinoza to today's home care. So, but indeed, if you can recommend me some literature, I'll be extremely happy. Yeah.
Théoriquement, on est extrêmement en retard. We are very late.
Oh, sorry about
So,
that. Yeah.